Okay, so hi, Chris, Eric, Mark. We're back to talk about chapter 10. There was a lot in chapter 10. Yeah, and you all missed the red plaid memo except for me and Chris. so I am preparing for my
I
semester,
was
which is going to begin on Monday. So got a couple of things yet to do, but yeah, looking forward to talking about this stuff today because I thought there was a lot of interesting meat in here. And it begins with St. Thomas Aquinas, which seems very appropriate given that I've also been, reading and watching videos about Adler, and he was apparently quite a fan. So everything fits together some way or other. And there's been a lot of activity in the vault in the forum today this morning.
yeah, no Annie again. If there's no Annie, there's no Westwick
No Annie
Commons.
again, I guess. Although you did kind of call her out in the notes, Tim, I think. But yeah, and maybe this wasn't a book that really excited her as much as the other ones. You never know. People have other reasons for not being able to. But in any case, so what do we want to say about the Middle Ages? I thought it was. I guess I'll start. I thought it was interesting that that Graeber wants to begin the Middle Ages earlier and outside of Europe, which kind of fits in with my interest in sort of non-Western world history.
I like the fact that he did that.
Yeah.
And it's a nice, hey, let's cast a wider net, which is an interesting way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was kind of a weird thing too. I think he also, in saying that in the very early section, he made a comment like, we think of it as essentially, you know, it's Europe, but for the framing of the time, it's the hinterlands outside of Rome
Mm-hmm.
that are the parts we think about too, which is it really underlines that heavy Western framing of like we're talking about like middle of nowhere essentially, where there isn't culture, there isn't as much, build up, and all the cities are dying.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right,
which
and
is
then the city's dying, right? And then when he
yeah,
returns to that later, and he talks about how Roman Gaul was hell for the peasants because they were feeding these cities. And I thought that was really interesting.
yeah, but it's kind of like, hey, I'm gonna sideline Western civilization, but I'm gonna put the knife in and twist it a little while I'm at it. Um,
Mhm. Yeah, it's not only central, but it's also not what you thought it was.
But of course, at this point, you've got all of the end of the Anglo-Saxon come, Viking come, the English become the British almost, with England finally getting to be what it now is, almost, give or take. But you've got all of the things like the Book of Kells and Lindisfarne, all that sort of thing coming through as those elements of culture, all the Saxon gold and stuff we find at Sutton, in much the same way as we find glorious stuff elsewhere in what seem to be like unexpected periods. The other thing, of course, is at this point, Constantinople, Byzantium becomes much more, I suppose, and it's only 1452, 1454,
53.
at which point the Turks take over.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's also at this period, this earlier period that is pointed at, there's a lot of toing and froing with how far the Muslims get round into France, they get pushed back into Spain, and then get pushed back into the southern part of Spain. And it sort of stays relatively settled for quite a while. But for completely other reasons, somebody came up with a review of the 2011 or the 2018, I think, one of the two, film The Conspiracy, the Kenneth Branagh dramatisation of the Wannsee Conference, which reminded me of the standard quote that I've used in this group at other times for what would be the education policy for an Ostlander area under the Nazis. And there is the pre-assassination of Heydrich, which obviously comes up with the Wannsee Conference, commentary in Czech, where the Czech Quisling's equivalent are complaining about how much it costs to educate the Slav part of the population. They only need to be able to write their name, read a few words, count, do arithmetic to 50. And then quite early on, they were talking about redoing the old laws, sutras, I don't know if you pronounce it, were therefore still put down, but all of the ability for money, etc., changed such that Romans could have all the money and all the control, but they weren't allowed to directly fight for it or work for it. They were just given it as a right. And it sort of echoes of the education that's mentioned there as they don't need to have one because they're never easily going to get out of their caste position. And you get 3 or 4 generations of being talked about for the low villagers owning money as a ploughman or work as a ploughman, or the, so you get the grandchildren and the great grandchildren finally passing over the final piece. At which point, of course, I'm sure there'll be a lot of dodgy dealings of saying, "Oh, no, it doesn't say that educated. It actually says whatever, or whatever." Because we see that all over with slavery type things, or they get retracked by the next loan because they've got nothing now. They need something now, so they go through it all again. So that was sort of quite a, we could join that up a bit. So how much ancient fascism might be called upon. In fact, the control of the money, what was the control elsewhere? They're just not necessarily a genocide in quite the same way. But I'm sure there were plenty of those. But
I'm not sure I follow in what you're. I mean, you're kind of bouncing back and forth between cultures and time periods.
You've got
the thread.
You've got the Brahmins taking over in this now new period, where they're reinstating the old laws, but saying, according to
they only apply to us.
That they don't reapply it equally as it used to be. They are applying it in such that they always come out on top and are allowed to collect and accrue, etc. They have the hardship of they ought to go vegetarian and they ought not to get involved in fights, which is a real hardship, really, given the type of food and all the rest of it tends to come out of there anyway. And the really bottom castes get, there's this usual pyramid of how many thousands and millions of these people. You said about supporting the cities, and it's not really in some respects, it's not really supporting the cities, it's supporting the caste system rather than just the urbanisation, which may well be part parcel, but it's not necessarily from the writing item the actual real reason as opposed to just a consequence.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of odd because this is, this book is what, 10 to 15 years old, right? And from its original. And I think that a lot had changed in, sort of the ways that we understood, especially caste in India, and also kind of urbanity and what it implied, sort of between, it seems to me, between debt and dawn of everything, right? And so I think that there are things that he says in this that he probably, going back after his experience of doing all of the, the researching and writing and talking with, David Wengrow, that he did to come up with the dawn of everything. He might have changed some of his lines on these. I think that the things that he generalizes across all these cultures are, seems to me, are kind of interesting, but not. I don't know if I would imagine them as being kind of conclusive. Mark, it looked like you wanted to kind of throw something in.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things I thought was kind of interesting is how Graeber found multiple examples of how people profess a certain set of beliefs, but always find a way to hedge.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't charge interest. I mean, there's on and on examples of that. You can't charge interest except to these people, because we're really enemies and at war, and this is just a different version of war. Or if I lend you $1,000, that means that I can't make money myself on that $1,000. So we're going to call it $1,100 because that would be a truer representation of what I've lent you. I mean, they're just example after example of this. It's not interest, but it's your house is collateral on your loan, and you're living in this house. So we're not going to call it interest. We're going to say you're paying me rent. I mean, there's. He goes through a lot of examples. If you kind of look at all of the things and what they come up with, kind of as ways to hedge on what they. I don't know if that's a normal human tendency, or he doesn't really make it. To me that's a theme. You talk about generalities that's in there almost consistently, but I don't think he ever says, look at this. This is, you can find examples of this, whatever the culture that you're describing, of this hedge orientation, ways of finding. And I don't know if that's about self-deception or what that involves. I mean, with religion, sometimes it's about, well, we need to find a way to make this okay because it doesn't sound good.
Well, and is it just a coincidence that I'm seeing that it appears, it seems, inordinately in religious contexts, right? Where you've got a set of and good morning, Annie. I noticed you snuck in there. That it happens, because
It's
there are
in
these
this chapter where the central role of religion in controlling, or not allowing interest generating loans it's like, okay, we didn't see this elsewhere, or maybe we did, I just didn't notice it before.
Well, the idea that there may be, I mean, and that whole thing about, that there's some type of connection between war and lending, right? And that if you think of economic competition as, this war without the swords kind of activity, that maybe, I mean, he's kind of presenting it in a sort of a cynical format, but but
Right.
maybe that, that makes sense in the sense that, that there is definitely, it seems to me, at least a transition from the Old Testament to the New, where in the Old Testament, clearly there is a tribe and there are enemies outside the tribe, right? That, where pretty much everything is allowed, and then at least in some, interpretation of the Gospels, everybody is, part of this new family of
But when you say it, we didn't see it before until, well, we started, he saw this, the religious underpinning of this. It's almost like, okay, because we say we have values, now we need a way to justify when we don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but while we're on that topic of interest, I think he actually placed it at 1187, where the church essentially said you can't charge higher prices when you're selling on credit. So that becomes kind of the new law of the land, which ostensibly has, at least in most Western countries, I take it, been kind of an unwritten rule, literally to the point that credit card companies put it in the fine print of the agreement businesses sign with them. If you're Walmart, you can't charge a higher price when somebody uses a credit card.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but since the pandemic, and roughly in 2022 into 2023, especially a lot of mom and pop shops, who, and generally they're paying 2.5 to 3.1% off the top of your purchase, goes directly to service the credit card fee.
Mm-hmm.
And so I go to a restaurant and they want to know first how I'm going to pay before they'll tell me what the price is. And it generally tends to be mom and pop places versus the bigger corporations who have more fungibility. But a mom and pop restaurant, it's life and death for them to save that 3%. So they're now passing that on to the customer, and the credit card companies don't seem to care or are not enforcing it. And that has been a massive shift that, I now have the date 1187 as a point to like say, here's where it shifted. And now we have 2022 as it's shifting the other way. Yeah, and what does that mean for society?
The distinction is that they're not charging. Well, the fine print says you can't charge a different price. The way that mom and pops get around it, and I think justifiably, is for the process of doing this on credit, because I have to pay a swipe fee plus percentage. I'm going to pass some of that along to you as a service, not as the cost of the goods or services provided.
Well, most small mom and pops are not. They don't know that clause exists. They're doing it so they don't have to pay the fee.
Yeah, the coffee shop I go to when I'm up north just purchased this big sophisticated software system, and on their checkout it comes up with two different bars, one
cash price
credit card and one for, and Starbucks or whatever down here in Minneapolis would never do that.
Right.
But and I ask them about it, and they don't defend it. They just say they give you this thing about how much it costs them to use a credit card on a $3 cup of coffee.
Right. Yeah, because it's like 50 cents to swipe the card.
Yeah.
Well, for ATM bank cards, typically it's a flat fee of like 25 or 35 cents.
Yeah.
But for credit cards, it's wildly different. And if you make a $10,000 purchase,
whatever,
that's not an insignificant amount of money for them.
Yeah. No,
in fact, our local school, when we pay tuition, it's, hey, I'll pay cash, and they'll give the Catholic school tuition. I'll pay cash, and they give me the lower price.
It was the same.
Well, is that what the Apple Card that it was at least for a while funded through, I forget what big gives you money back 2 to 3%, and they must be like splitting the difference somehow with you on what they would make off the top to try to get you to use. Is that the way that works?
Well, the other thing, of course, is you purchase things, particularly things that are, Chris said about a $10,000 purchase. You buy a decent sized purchase, you've got a lot more consumer protection against that purchase. If you're buying travel, it comes a lot of the time. It comes with automatic insurance. If it's camera gear or even a car, you get often insurance over and above what the dealer will give you for the first year, etc., etc. So there are things, and it's like this particular mail that I'm in at the moment. Everything you buy, you can, even if you don't use a credit card, you can take the chit slip, put it onto your airline miles program for the local airline, and literally every dollar I spend, I get like 5 cents worth of flights. So, it doesn't take that long if you decide, okay, there are 4 of these miles under the same regime. I could quite easily live in all my purchases in those 4 miles. They cover all the brands, and I even just here 600 food outlets. I mean, for Christ's sakes, okay, 11 of them are Starbucks, but but it's a big mount, right? It's well over 3, must be almost 4 million square feet. And that's just retail space. It's not even circulation space. And so with that in-flight item, I only need 1 flight from here to the UK to get 1 free with a normal 6 months worth of purchase. So, and it's not always the most expensive place either. So, we currently, obviously we've got the post-Christmas sales, and we've got 70% off in a lot of instances. But there's no mom and pop shops here, though. They're all major
Well,
chains.
if you watched in the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, Walmart actually applied for and became a bank. There is a wing of Walmart that is now a bank, and in part they did it so that they could get around a chunk of that credit card processing fee and become a processor themselves, so they can save that internally. And because they're doing so many transactions, it makes a huge amount of sense for them to do that, as well as for 10 other reasons. But generally, the rate you pay to the credit card processing can vary. I think I've seen it as low as 1.5%. So if you're Walmart and you go to Visa, Visa's going to say, yeah, you do so many transactions, we're going to cut your rate. Whereas the mom and pop shop is almost assuredly paying 2.9 to 3% or more, because they don't have the negotiating power to get a lower rate.
But I mean, the other one that came up on a similar thing was the aging out of all the points you get on your Starbucks card, and the sheer number of people that just bought one and never used it, where you're pre-buying a certain amount of points to get coffee, and it put so much cash into Starbucks, it was unbelievable. Such that you've got to worry that somebody decides they'll go around and say, we'd like to buy all your old Starbucks cards back up. And they may go and try and take the money out. So,
yeah. Amex is a weird case, because they have that legacy cachet. I think that's something else that helps them, kind of stay at a higher rate. I mean, they were the first, and and they had it was a different it was kind of a different structure.
It's not a credit card; it's a charge card. There's no
Yeah,
no
well,
credit
they do
limit.
have a credit. They have a credit card now, or at least they did for a while. I haven't been following them, but yeah, it was a charge. Yeah, it was a charge card. You had to pay it at the end of the month in full, which I remember. But it was it was a prestige card, and so that was plunking down the American Express card. I remember back in the day was a thing. Um, but yeah, what about I wrote down a couple of things as we were talking about that, back, that were more historical. One of the things that struck me was that when he talks a lot, Graeber talks a lot about how this Carolingian economy that sort of existed, for centuries after the actual, little empire of Charlemagne. I wonder how much of that was kind of enabled by the Muslim invasion, right? Would there have been this, the empire didn't last politically very long, but kind of culturally and economically, it had this long tail. Was that really kind of created by the fact that they were, able to turn away the Saracens coming up out of the Iberian Peninsula at the beginning of the 8th century, so is that really kind of a moment that sort of determines that, and so that kind of struck me as interesting. The other thing that kind of jumped out at me was this idea that Chrétien de Troyes was lived right there, in the middle of this economic, the Champagne fair and all of this economic activity, and he's the guy who's behind this whole Arthurian romance, and this and this idea of the romance as kind of a counterpoint to out of the way, buddy, to all this kind of profit maximization, or profit seeking, on the part of even the Crusaders, and the Templars and all these guys. I thought that was a really interesting kind of look at the romantic Middle Ages, at the romanticization of the Middle Ages.
So we're all going to have to read Dan Brown again, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I'm going to try to avoid that. Although Dan Brown actually does sort of appear at the end of a bunch of the other kind of conspiracy theory stuff that I'm reading for my plutocracy research. But the and the whole idea that a lot of this goes back to these Saint Ambrose's exception, and all this, that this stuff is all really kind of turns on those types of decisions, or theories, or
Yeah.
interpretations.
Well, looking at the Chrétien Arthurian stuff, I almost read some of that as, because I think most historians who specialize in it acknowledge that at some place there was someone named Arthur, whether he was actually a king or not, or a tribe band leader in southwest England, or potentially Wales. I think there's enough evidence to say there was a guy, but there's no contemporaneous material and very scant archaeological evidence that there was somebody, but I see a lot of that kind of myth and legend around him almost as being there was organization and structure before and things were good, and in the 6th, 7th, 8th century things aren't quite as good, especially for the general people. So there becomes built up this myth of, kind of make Camelot great again, if you want to frame it that way. Kind of idea of this strong man came out and pushed out, and it's at a time where the Angles and the Saxons are invading from the continent, and you've also got, the barbarian tribes from Scandinavia moving south by sea. And so that, legend and myth kind of spreads. And I think that Chrétien becomes the first Frenchman, really, or person outside of England who's writing and romanticize, and it really begins a heavy romanticization of that legend and turns it into something else. And then there are one or two writers who kind of pull that Arthurian legend into the Scandinavian saga tradition as well around that time or thereafter, and turn it into a whole nother thing. But that piece always kind of fascinates me. But
on a similar vein, partly because obviously it's English, British, but it's also well thrown through the likes of Hollywood. There's a guy called Nick Hodges on YouTube who does history buffs, and he reviews historical based films, even down to the Save It Private Ryan, Waterloo, Lawrence of Arabia, that sort of thing. And I think his last one, or last but one was the relatively recent Russell Crowe Robin Hood story. And much of the time he used in the review was these were all the different versions of the Robin Hood story that he's been able to dig up, half of which have nothing to do with Sherwood Forest. Many of them don't have much to do with Richard Lionheart, Richard I. Many of them don't have anything to do with Robert or Locksley either, etc., etc., etc. So, of course, there's the Cosner version, Russell Crowe version, Sean Connery version, even in his retirement, as it were. And that comes up as being close on to being, 800 plus years ish later than Merlin and Arthur and all the rest of it. Yet we still can't pin it down. And there are missing bodies or missing burial sites of kings in Western Europe. So, there's bound to be things that just don't get written down because at the time there's no money or there was nobody to write or whatever. And it's one of those things that has somewhat impressed me about the book generally, or about money in one form or another, is that, of course, the earliest records of the use of writing way back at the beginning of the book is this is the debt between Fred and Joe, and it lasts 10 years, so we're going to put it in a clay envelope with a clay tablet with the details inside, and it's going to be held in escrow by the lawyer type thing, who's going to open it at year 10 to see what the terms and conditions in detail were, and what's the numbers and all that. And that sort of the things that go on around money that aren't really money, or even straightforward, simple numerical economics, has been quite eye-opening with this. I'm looking forward to the end, really. Um, the I don't think that chapter 10 makes enough of the change in slavery condition as much as it could. Of course, at this point, we're talking Black Death and the numbers of people, particularly in Europe, dropping. So that starts people deciding they have value. So, get Wat Tyler versus whichever Henry it was, or Edward, coming up with a deal, and then the tier 2 bosses decide to take him out round the corner, nullifying the apparent the equivalent of a Wall Street occupation victory. And so that's been entertaining. The other one that I'm not sure that I fully understand, I might have to go back and reread, was the way he talks about in chapter 10, the Chinese section, where the imperial side and the economics of the merchants stayed separate for so long. Yet things that we see in places like Japan shows that that's a fiction, but he didn't seem to show it's a fiction for China. Whereas, of course, nobility, stroke the bosses, and therefore their war plans particularly, were all constrained by money in Europe, hence Paul Kennedy's book on the economics of warfare back in the 80s.
Well, in China,
Which was all about the actual mechanisms and the actual numbers involved in them. Where, how did I get the money to build this army and go and get? Was it an economic actual?
In China,
actual positive.
There's a big, I think, China's so big that there's, I think, a huge distinction that probably should be made between internal commerce and external commerce. I mean, we tend to think about the Silk Road in this era, and the kind of the revival of the Silk Road after the caliphates really basically pacify the region between the Mediterranean and Central Asia. But I think that one of the things about China was that their internal market was always so huge that they never, that was one of the reasons that they sort of were able to sort of maintain this self description as the Middle Kingdom, right, where they were between heaven and the world of the barbarians, and so because they were internally self-sufficient. But the mandate of heaven often consisted to a great extent of preventing famines by making sure that the civil service was getting things done, was cleaning out the irrigation system so that it wouldn't silt up, right? And so time and time again, when there's a transition, there's a changeover in dynasties, it has to do with the current dynasty getting sort of decadent, and like the and taking their eye off the ball, and then somebody else coming along and saying, you have even Hong Wu, the first Ming emperor, right? I mean, that it was a peasant revolt because of the plague and then the famines that followed, and they were able to to overthrow the Mongols and kick them out and reestablish, you know, a Han Chinese dynasty because of this internal failure of the internal economy. So I think that there's a lot going on there that, you know, that Graeber doesn't really kind of address in terms of the difference between you know, kind of what's going on within the country and what's going on elsewhere. I mean, you know, and obviously that gets even more complicated because the first, you know, so the Ming come in what, 1368, right, and then you know, and then Hongwu rules for 30 years, and then he dies, and he passes the crown to his grandson, but his fourth son, Zhu Di, actually overthrows the grandson and becomes the Yongle emperor and moves the capital from Canton to Beijing, which is his territory, his region, and then employs Zheng He, right, to go on his famous excursions, which are not trade missions, right? And so Tim, that's the photo that you sent me from the mall of the treasure ship, that, you know, that he took, you know, but mostly they were not bringing treasure back as much as they were lavishing gifts on anybody who would come back to Beijing and kowtow to the emperor. So it's not a commercial mission. So it's not. I mean, it doesn't fit really. I guess there's a long way of saying that China doesn't fit neatly into this story.
Well, the other thing that I can recall coming up with China was the sheer volume of stuff that it was getting from all the surrounding space in tribute. Effectively nation on nation tax. And this Obsidian researcher, Eleanor Contact, has done quite a bit of stuff on the tribute side. So you dig around in Substack, I think it's in there by now, assuming you're still open Substack.
I subscribe to Eleanor's Iceberg. Yeah.
Yeah. If you go back, probably about the time slot that we were doing Aaron Sorkin's book, she did 3 or 4 of her own newsletters, not the Obsidian one, because she now merged the two. She was doing them separate.
Right.
On the tribute economy type raison d'etre and the mechanisms, etc. And then, of course, there's, you know, the stuff that was going backwards and forwards with all of the Zheng He stuff. On a similar basis, that's only one relatively small, short period.
Yeah, it was like 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, which is, even in terms of this book, it's a trivial trifle. 25 years, 30 years. Then there's the way we go back a step before the current period being spoken about, and that republic stroke empire levels, Egypt paid tribute to Rome via food primarily. It's where the bread came from.
That's what they were, the bread basket.
So how much of that was simple, basic, normal free trade versus how much of that was actually tribute? I don't know. One assumes it was a bit of a mix. I can't see it being all one or the other, but maybe so. But I thought the milk one was another way of saying one of my parents, with the mother being the primary, but you know, if daddy doesn't do his work, mommy doesn't feed, so she can't feed you. Which honour thy parents like to.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I remember reading Eleanor's tribute posts. I mean, I can't quote them because it was a couple of years ago. But but I do remember sort of disagreeing with her on some of the fine points. But that's really not here nor there. But I think that what you're talking about, Tim, it kind of leads to some interesting questions about sort of tribute and freedom and serfdom, right? Because one of the things that Graeber talks about a lot is how is sort of how we. I mean, he goes several times already. We've noticed that he said, "Well, somebody who hands over their freedom at the door of the factory, right, by entering into this wage agreement." And I think that I've said previously, and I'm sticking to it, that I think that he's over playing that hand. I don't think that there's the same kind of that there's I don't think that those are that I think that there's it's hard. I think they were kind of incommensurable, the idea of slavery versus you know yeah, I agree. I think that it's kind of a bias, that comes from spending a long time in that anarchist world. But I do think that there is an interesting question there about when debt peonage begins to look like slavery. When being tied, being a serf who's tied to the land, right? And theoretically there's some type of a relationship, a reciprocal relation. He talks sometimes about reciprocal relationships and this social order where the priest prays for all and the soldier fights for all. And he tries for a moment there to kind of equate. And this goes back to what you were saying much earlier, Tim, about the different, the four castes, the four main castes of the laws of Manu in India, right? And this idea that that priests pray and soldiers fight and peasants, and he says, well, there's only three in medieval Europe, and peasants do everything, or priests, but for whatever, I guess my question is that how much of that is, to go to what Chris was saying earlier, how much of that is about sort of rationalizing this? I mean, it's almost like a protection racket, right? Oh, nice store. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. I mean that these people, and then he says, notwithstanding, all of that unfreedom, it was much worse to be a peasant in Roman Gaul than, the burden was much heavier than it was even in, the medieval world. So.
Well, what you've said reminds me of I think it's Ecclesiastes 3, to everything there is a season. So this is also a time where you're going from kind of a sociology of a primary government pushing everything down to suddenly now it's the church creating that structure.
Mm-hmm.
And a version of the great chain of being. So everybody has a place on this structural ladder.
Yeah.
And you better get in your place or, everything on the ladder is going to fall down on your head. Generally no one questioned their place. Mm-hmm. Or at least the broader populace didn't. It was, here's our lot in life and let's go. Or at least I've never seen any evidence outside of that to suggest that happened frequently.
Well, and there wasn't an idea of social mobility because there really wasn't an idea of progress, right? If there was any, if there were kind of any thoughts about, the way that time was organized, it was more cyclical, right? That you had this, the wheel of the year was kind of, the great chain of being and the wheel of the year were the big, kind of the overriding, um,
Well, and then, as I
structures.
recall too, the Wheel of the Year was more a pagan construct too, wasn't it?
Mhm.
Or was that wasn't coming out of Christianity or earlier like Roman?
No, I think they appropriated it, like lots of things.
Yeah.
But it does suggest though that you don't think. I mean, it's kind of funny because I watch. I don't really watch them anymore, but when I was younger, I used to watch pretentious movies, like Menon of the Spring, right? And the thing that reminds me,
Pretentious movies.
I don't remember much about that, except what I do remember is that these people lived in this kind of society where things were very kind of static, right? Social relations were not particularly fluid. Everybody kind of had their place. They knew their place. Um, it, it's yeah. I mean, it's an interesting movie, but the world, the kind of story world that it seems to be set in is I mean, and it's modern France, right? But it doesn't. It seems very much like kind of uh, this medieval world.
I
So
have to say, with the holidays being almost over, and Monday really will mark the force back of everyone into the real world.
yep.
Um, the one thing I do miss from like that kind of Middle Ages period is the idea of Saint Monday, or even Saint Tuesday for that matter. It's we should bring that idea back
Mm,
into our wheel of time.
yeah, yeah. It's yeah. So there seems well, and I guess maybe what all of this is sort of pointing at is that there seems to be this that when there's commerce and when there's sort of the logic of markets, um, oftentimes there's some type of romantic uh, pushback to it, even if it's fictional. Apparently, it's Friendly Cat Day. This one doesn't sit on my lap as much as the other one, but this morning he's on me. So, yeah, and this is the chapter in which we also got um, the Crusaders going for profits and attacking fellow Christians, right? So it's yeah, the idea of knighthood was, and then he goes on and he kind of gets philosophical and he talks about the whole idea of symbols and where the concept of symbols came from and the broken. And it's kind of funny because I went to a Zen meditation thing with my son last night. And they had not a yin yang, but a circle with a straight line through it and a black side and a white side. And I thought about the snapping the chits and making to make a
The
contrast.
other thing, of course, is we moves on to Islam, particularly because it takes over North African coast and Spain and bits of France, etc. And the debt and nursery type thing that I find it is they don't call it interest, they call it profit. Yeah. If you take out a loan for a car or whatever with an Islamic based bank, which is coincidentally just behind that one, they have to take the same amount of principal and invest it in things that will give a dividend equal to the cost of your profit, such that they spread out the good cheer of that. So, yeah, they're getting why 5% and they have to get at least 5% on their orange hedge fund or their gold investment or whatever. And in theory, you could go along and bang on the door and say, show me. Which bit did you invest? Where did you invest? What did you do? Because of your loan. I'm not quite sure what happens if you default.
Well, so you're saying that the rate that the interest rate that they're calling a profit, they have to demonstrate the opportunity cost
Yes.
of investing the money elsewhere.
They have to demonstrate the actual receipt of that profit from the investment that they make in parallel in the normal markets. I don't think it has to be shares and stocks. So it can just be any sort of instrument, I think. They just have to, you say you borrow 10,000 dibdobs to buy a car, they have to spend another 10,000 on gold shares or ADNOC shares or whatever. Oddly enough, in terms of the economy here, particularly, the quarter that's just finished, we're now down to less than 5% oil revenue driven. And the non-oil revenue has increased by just almost 6% this year, last account. And that's driving privatization of it. So at the moment, it used to be that the municipality of the city of Dubai owned and operated the roads, owned and operated the taxis and the buses.
Mm-hmm.
And those three things, they formed a new government company. Literally, maybe a year or two before I arrived. That was also, therefore, the owner of the metro system, which was being built as I arrived. So, where I started to live, they were literally building a track. It's like an L in Los Angeles, all elevated. Mm-hmm. With a little bit underground, but it's got to get underneath the creek. So we don't actually go over the creek. We go underneath the creek. Mm. So to get underneath, they've got to be a station or two either side to get underneath. And there wasn't quite a space above ground in the real old town that went either side of a creek for a couple of kilometres. So it just goes under and pops up a couple of miles inland. So the RTA was called, the Road and Transport Authority, was created to operate the roads and give contracts for road repairs. It administers the taxes, all the licensed taxes. And of course, Uber's come along since, but they've allowed Uber to happen. And they've allowed people to create their own Uber. So there's another two types of Uber we have here. One of whom also does all the delivery to motorbikes as well. And one of the other companies that was within the RTA, one of the other functions, was they collected the road tolls by a simple device that slapped on your windscreen. And you just went underneath the detectors based on various roads at various places. So the SALIC, which was the toll, is about to be privatized, as is the taxis on their own. So the RTA is suddenly have all the cost of building and maintaining the roads, which includes fixing all the drainage problems, running the buses and running the metro. At the moment, metro and the roads will be all that RTA is. But as an aside, because the RTA was always seen as a good management process place, they get given various government contracts. So there is a museum here called the Etihad Museum, which is literally about the 6 months between when Britain said, we're going to stop being the trucial states and look after your defence, and there being a UAE of 5 emirates, and repulsing the Saudi invasion in that gap. And then another emirate joined, but Bahrain and Qatar never said yes, and they were involved in negotiations. There's a whole museum for that, and that was built by the RTA, or at least they managed to put the contract. So it's a strange hybrid, but it's now being have its various tentacles chopped off for making various bits and pieces private. So IPOs abound. Same way as the Saudis actually put the Saudi oil company up, or at least a portion of it. So you can own shares in Aramco.
So I guess the question then is, will they net enough revenue or profit from that, from the spinning off of these things in IPOs, that they can then set up, sort of endowment or even sinking fund kind of financial instruments that will allow them to continue financing themselves?
Well, I'm not actually sure what they're going to do with the profit, other than it goes into the government coffers, that tombs coffers, and disappears. But they've just finalised the announcement for the third, or maybe even third and fourth rail lines for the metro. That's like another 13 billion. What was it? It might have even been $30 billion. So we've got at least another one line, if not two, that puts another. The aim is to put another 4 million people onto the system within a 15-minute walk.
Right. Well, and that was actually, Eric just said something in the chat that was kind of in the back of my mind too as I was asking that. I mean, it does seem like there are all of these kind of neoliberal privatization interests, and some of them seem to be based on some type of logic, like, okay, we will, because there is such a thing as making enough money that you kind of create an endowment, and Graeber actually talks about that in the in these going all the way back to almost prehistory, right? These people who gave sums of money to temples that would finance pay for that would pay for half a dozen monks to be fed and things like that. So there is there is this concept of perpetuity of wealth, ownership, and control that is probably also needs to be kind of talked about in the context of debt, right? Because if debt can they're almost two sides of the same coin, right? So wealth is perpetuated and is owned in perpetuity, and debt can be as well. Maybe going back to the place where we stopped having, and it was Christianity, right? That eliminated the wiping out of the debts on the 7th year, the sabbatical year. So according to I think it was in this chapter, it might have been the previous chapter, that it wasn't until Christian Rome, I think, that the sabbatical was kind of phased out, or there was at least a way to write contracts that would be sabbatical proof. And that seems to be, that seems to be the necessary corollary of if we're going to have families or nations or or corporations that have control of assets perpetually, then somehow debt has to probably also be perpetual, doesn't it? But yeah, the
Although
Chicago. Go ahead.
is that the purpose of what he's writing here though, is to reframe what debt is, and is debt in fact perpetual? A lot of
No, I think that that's the assumption that he's arguing against, isn't it?
well, yeah, in general,
Yeah.
but that's the thing, is he's reframing it, a thing that it seems like it's a fabric of who we are and what we do, and we don't think about it, and we don't question it.
Right.
But by looking back at the history and the historiography of the space, you see, okay, people have done this different ways in different places, or even, and it's one of the reasons I pointed out the charging a higher price switches in the 1100s.
Right.
And it's now seems to be switching back because of a global pandemic and, economic pressures in the modern day.
Right.
There's that subtle shift.
Right.
And it's those small, subtle shifts that either put you on a track of somewhere better for the whole, or put you on a track for better for a few, maybe.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I would imagine that from Graeber's perspective, it would match up, right? That the idea that he's arguing against, sort of the objectivity and perpetuity of debt, he's also, by implication, arguing against this objectivity and perpetuity of wealth, right? That it would completely make sense to Graeber that assets shouldn't be held generation after generation after generation. I mean, especially things like land, right? Which in other cultures aren't. And land is the basis of it all, really. So I think that it does get much more, radical than he's even willing to approach, probably in this. But yeah, it all seems to be of a piece. The water utilities, yeah. I was thinking that when Eric mentioned Chicago, I was thinking of the water war in Bolivia in 2000 as well. This idea that that we will have the IMF and the World Bank will go into the rest of the world, and actually Nestle and a couple of other mostly French concerns kind of were really ahead of the game in water privatization in Europe as well, and that but that doesn't seem to be done. Maybe in Europe it's done with a little bit more care, but in South America, when they did it in Bolivia, they didn't even pay any attention to to providing waters or to hooking up. Half the city, more than half the city of Cochabamba wasn't even hooked up, and yet they came in, and in order to make it work, make the business work and make it profitable, they outlawed, collecting rainwater off of your roof and buying water from tanqueros who brought it in from the countryside and all of that, and yet half of the people still weren't connected to the water. See the big myth. Yeah. Yeah. So what about this? He ends on this idea of the corporation as this fictional immortal person. I love that. I thought that was that was a nice. I thought the chapter was structured very nicely, and he ended on and kind of he brought it to that place where he's talking about symbols, and he's talking about words being symbols, and he's talking about um, angels and corporations. It was beautiful.
Well, that's the immortal person is the corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do I incorporate myself and
And become
thereby
immortal.
become immortal?
Yeah.
Because and it's a weird thing that it almost goes, and I'm not sure if it goes back before the East India Company, but the incorporation of that entity is a thing that was in itself its own nation state and kind of created its own influence, has allowed us to politically turn corporations into people who can't be held to account.
Right.
So if a corporation does something horrible, generally we're not holding the directors or the CEO or the board to account for their actions. And it gets brushed off onto, oh, it's the corporation did this, more often than not. But the corporation's feet are never held to the fire, and it never pays out. Or in cases of kind of environmental eco-terrorism, where a company comes in and strip mines Montana, all the profits of the corporation are put into the pockets of the directors and the investors, and then the company itself goes bankrupt and disappears. And then when it's time to pay the piper for cleaning up the mess, somebody else covers the cost. So in those cases, the corporation becomes the thing is going to die, and never, and the Sackler family somehow hadn't figured out this is really the way to structure things. Or maybe the Sackler family is an example of this corporate structure not being a thing that's going to protect you anymore, depending on what happens with the courts, and do they have to pay personal money out. But I think too, we treat corporations as people outside of the fact that they can't vote. But you give us a minute and we'll fix that.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to be where U.S. politics is going.
Yep.
Or we've got so much money we can just buy votes and we'll free speech it in.
Yeah, Morton Horowitz wrote the book on that.
Oh yeah.
And it was very much about a gradual sort of sub rosa process of no legislation happening at all, right? Just a bunch of not even big court cases, not even appellate or Supreme Court cases, but but local court cases about property disputes kind of established this whole regime that we have. And then, and one of the really interesting and one of the kind of the important aspects of that book is he not only kind of shows it happening, but then at the end of it, he talks about how, once this was accomplished, it had to then be swept under the rug and, and hidden so that people wouldn't understand that that's how it happened, and people would believe instead that there was something objective and pure and kind of almost God-given about the set of precedents that led to this understanding of corporate rights and their lack of actual responsibilities that corresponded to those rights. Yeah, and it's very and it was very much about this long process of as Chris has said, sort of privatizing the profits and socializing the externalities or the costs or the acts of God. When the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire burned down, or the was it the Pennington factory that fell down in Massachusetts in 1860? Um, just because they filled it with too many new machines. Um, yeah, there's just so much of that, and and that I really I would love to be able to to kind of focus more attention on that transition, and Horowitz's student Ted Steinberg did in talking about the textile mills in New England in Nature Incorporated, I think it was, which was his dissertation for Horowitz and who else was David Hackett Fisher, I think, and I don't remember the third guy who was his main dissertation committee member, but he had a really stellar crew of people advising him, and he applied all of Horowitz's ideas really to that case. So yeah, so the idea that and it's interesting, because initially there was this idea of charter, when it was originally royal charter, but then it was state charter after the American colonies got their independence, right? Being about providing some type of a public service and and meeting a socially desirable need. And also about liability that would that would be applied or that would accrue to the people who were doing that if they for example if if a sawmill or a grist mill flooded somebody's fields, right, you would have to make some type of restitution, and the farmer was actually able originally in Massachusetts common law to break the dam until the case could be heard and judged, which was of course especially relevant when not everybody had court, right? You had these circuit judges running around, who you'd have to wait to see. So I would love to be able to focus more attention on kind of those issues, just to argue against kind of the inevitability and and sort of obvious logical necessity of things existing as they corporations existing as they do now, with all the privileges that they have now and none of the responsibilities. So what else we got? Graeber says a lot in this chapter. Oh yeah, thanks.
I was sitting here looking for Horowitz in my repository and saw nothing, and I was like, I know I have seen it half a dozen times,
Yeah.
and it should be in my to read list. And then I look up a tag for it, and I find 4 references, and one of them is yours.
Yeah, I kind of harp on it a lot. But I do, but people tell me they don't read my historiography stuff. So I have to figure out another way to do it. I mean, I based a chapter in my environmental history textbook on Steinberg, and I think I mentioned at some point that it comes from that. But I do think that it's interesting, and actually the story that a way to connect that is with the story of the Charles River Bridge, which I also kind of harp on a lot, which has been interestingly one of those causes that people have like gone to the mattresses for. Like Naomi, what's her name? Naomi Lamoureux actually wrote a kind of a support of the position of the corporations in the Warren Bridge case. But yeah, so the Middle Ages, I think it's very interesting that he kind of Graeber kind of ties this all to this culture, especially, you know, now that we're entering, I guess it was not less meaningful, but it seems somehow more relevant and stickier now that it's, you know, the early modern period and we're getting into, you know, kind of our own, the traditions that kind of directly lead to us. Mark, what are you saying in the chat here?
That's just another topic, the justification for recognizing, accepting, promoting, you know, all these differences, which at some level makes sense, and it's even a biblical thing, right? To each, I don't know what forget the citation, but there's a section in there in which he talks about that. You know, if everybody was the same, then everybody, you know, he says perish, because everybody would be. The assumption seems to be everybody's specialized, but if they weren't, I mean, if they didn't specialize, then what needs to get done wouldn't get done. But it gravitates from that, which seems, yeah, okay, to we need rich people and poor people, or we need the rulers and the subservients somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I mean, that does seem to kind of get to that question of, you know, why plutocrats? You know, why do we have? And actually, what's her name? Chrystia Freeman, Chrystia Freeland, right? The woman who's in the Canadian cabinet now, wrote a book years ago as she was transitioning from journalism to government, called Plutocrats, which I read years ago, and it was. And I was confused when I read it because I couldn't really, you know, it was kind of one of those books that I read for the information in it, and not, you know, to be convinced of her perspective. But it was hard for me to actually, you know, as I was reading it for the information, to really understand exactly what her position was, because, you know, on the one hand, she was very critical, but on the other hand, she was very kind of supportive of the existence of, you know, this idea that, oh, we have to have these people. They have to, you know, they have to be, you know, we have to kind of get out of their way and let them do, you know, let Elon be Elon, because otherwise we won't have electric cars, or, you know, or a space program, or free speech on the internet, or whatever. Which is, you know, it's kind of funny because in that, this morning I clicked on a link. Who put the link to the in the community forum to the Guardian article? And, you know, so I click on that and I get this Guardian article, which, you know, at the bottom of it I get this big thing that says, "We are not owned by a billionaire." So they're asking for subscription money. So,
Well, this on the Guardian as a thing. They 4 years ago, 3 years ago, no, pre-COVID. So moving on then. When their sort of green environmental section used to either follow or was followed by, I can't remember which way around it was, but the long haul overseas holiday stuff. So where you're spending thousands, but they got hammered by a lot of the green type activists for the juxtaposition of that, and how that the fact that the articles, not just the advertising, were pushing in the opposite direction to their stated greenwash of, you know, we're a green paper, not just blue. And that argument won. So if you now pick up particularly a paper copy of the Guardian, or worse still, the Observer, which was the Sunday version, which was where all the big holiday stuff, the really big holiday stuff, well, let's go for 3 weeks to Antarctica, you know,
Yeah.
via Kilimanjaro sort of thing. Um,
So you can
uh,
see where the
all
glaciers
that,
don't exist anymore before you go see the glaciers.
yeah, before they go.
Last chance to see. Didn't
All that, they've dropped all that advertising.
Yep.
So they took a hit. They took a really big hit because these were, 15 to 20 pages on a regular basis of advertising for big style holidays. Some of it's come back, but they're more sort of the eco type. Yes. But one of the guys who's a bit of a Graeber type journalist who did
Audiences are going to love this show. Michelle, yeah, that's it.
we did the American Myth a few books back. He did a similar one of the corruption of the UK legal system and Dublin.
When you bring some friends to some of the filming locations.
Sorry about that.
Substitute state. And he was part and parcel of this gang of Greens that were beating up on the Guardian to actually lose the money from where its mouth was. And they ended up by doing so. He also managed to get a number of instances where he goes on to GBTV, i.e. the equivalent of Fox News, to stand up against a couple of right-wingers talking about things like asylum seekers of a problem, whatever. But the latest one that he did was with respect to farming in the food chain and the effect on the environment. And he apparently, his comment was he walked away without any bruises or anybody actually landing a punch, such that the normal anchor was on the virtual agreement with him versus this poor other journalist from somewhere was having to eat his burger without the patty but just extra lettuce. And so there is movement. I'm wondering just how much it will go. And the other thing, of course, with this Graeber and the earlier ones, that you could almost say the overall central theme is things along the lines of this is how it works now because we're so centralized, even though we use the word globalization for that centralization, as opposed to here's all the other modes and methods and versions and different forms that it could do, particularly in Dawn of Everything. And in here, to a certain extent, these are all the mechanisms we've been using before. Pick one, pick another one, use that as a target, use it as a model. You have to wonder where that might go. And what would have happened if the Wall Street protests would have gone longer and lasted better, the Arab Spring stuff. But we'll see.
It's kind of weird though, because there's again with the mythology stuff and with the sort of the what we were talking about earlier about sort of Graeber's sort of being in this anarchist tent for so long that some things sort of seem obvious to him. What I was looking for, and I accidentally opened Netflix, and that's where you got that sound in the background. There was a Netflix series that just dropped that my wife started watching, and I was like sort of sitting close by and heard some of it, and I got interested, and I watched a little bit of it too. Called "You Are What You Eat: The Twin Experiment." And it was kind of interesting, and it had but it was sort of like the only way that I can describe it is that everybody who worked on it must have been in the same filter bubble. because, on the one, in one moment so the editing was really kind of up and down. So in one moment you got this really interesting, actual thing that they're doing, this test, and they've got these twins, and they've got one of them eating vegan and one of them eating kind of omnivore, and they're putting them through a bunch of tests, and then they're having them work out with a trainer, and and before and after and all that, and that was interesting enough. But then along the way, they have, they sort of intercut this with a documentary about, how bad CAFOs are. And I understand how bad CAFOs, confined feeding, animal feeding operations are, these factories, where they raise, chickens or turkeys or pigs or cattle. But, and they showed that, and they showed a lot of how horrible that was. But they didn't actually check their facts. So they said things like there are 10 times more, that in terms of biomass, there's 10 times more biomass on the planet in the form of cattle than all other animals, which is patently false, right? It's not true. There is a relationship that has been documented between cattle and land mammals, which is in that neighborhood, right? That all these other land species of herbivores, and things that eat grass, that are somehow analogous to cattle, have been sort of pushed out, and that their ranges have been eliminated, and all that. But these things, there were a bunch these there's this one after another things that they were saying about kind of climate change and methane and cattle, and and that was just one example of of these of a bunch of kind of, it seemed to me, things that would kind of undermine the credibility of this very kind of relevant and true thing that they were saying. But it was almost the type of thing that would lend itself to somebody, and I'm sure, I haven't looked for it, but I'm sure that somebody on YouTube, from the right, is bashing this and saying this was financed by George Soros and the WEF as a way of getting us to all eat bugs. That you will eat no meat. That red meat.
And so you don't need your gun anymore. We'll have those as well.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, and so I mean, and one of the other things that they said was this: what they said that that they cited a study, and it's a study that's cited a lot, and it's miscited a lot, that said that the World Health Organization said that processed meat is a Class A carcinogen, right? By which they mean hot dogs and bologna, right? but they make this very short step from saying, they say processed meat and red meat, right? And then boom, there you have it, right? So and they misquote the study, which says that specifically that that processed meat has been linked with cancers. And then the study kind of goes on to speculate that possibly red meat might also be problematic. But they don't read nobody ever reads the qualifications. Nobody ever reads the caveats. They say processed meat and red meat give you cancer. And the way they present it in this documentary is they start almost like what we were talking about with the Conway and Oresky's book, with the tobacco industry, and how it was, how many hundreds of thousands of studies had to be published before the Surgeon General would finally say, oh, smoking is bad for you, right? And they draw this complete parallel between that and and red meat, and the cabal of factory farmers and and processed food corporations, now owned by the Chinese, so it's even worse, right? Because now it's all China's fault, uh, who are responsible for this. So it was. I mean, so that's. I guess I just went off on a long tangent there, but you know,
The issue, though, I find is somebody on the right will point to that and say, here's a thing that feeds into an identity piece. And most of the people who are reading it for that bit are just going to follow right along themselves. They're not actually going to go look at critically the claim that that person is making to see is it true or not true.
Mhm.
They're just not even going to make it that far.
Yeah.
They're just going to say, oh, yes, this feeds into my preconceived notion. And so I'm going to use it. But I might file it away as here's another feather in the quiver that I can,
Yep.
use to shoot the other side, even though it itself, I haven't verified it as a fact or not either. And I
Right.
think that's part of the issue is there's all this back and forth with no real checking of sources or
Mhm.
cross-referencing.
Right. And if it was adjacent to this one thing, then that lends it credibility. Right. So
Yeah.
then where does it, where do you walk off the cliff?
The
And
juxtaposition.
to make a joke, once you've got all these things, then you have a quiver full,
the and we'll interrogate Annie later as to her progress with the West Wing, but to get it in, since Annie's here, there is that scene in the last one season, with Leo McGarry's secretary is hosting the chief medical officer who's come to check Bartlett for his MS, and the secretary goes, there's a study that says chocolate causes cancer in white mice, and there's a study that talks about cheese causes cancer in white mice, and it goes on for 3 or 4 more. And she says, have we actually checked white mice? There are any white mice that don't get cancer? And the chief medical officer says, I'm not sure we have yet. And it was a classic of let's build a bit of obverse piece of logic.
Mhm.
Given work that I've done with white mice and 3 universities in their animal housing, and the level to which they go through and the controls they go through in the UK at least, the white mice don't get cancer any more than any other mice. But
But rats do get cancer, don't they? Because they're not
right,
by
the
evolution
problem
to
the
live
problem
very long in
the
nature.
the problem with rats as opposed to white mice was, of course, the MMR guy who decided to feed rats exclusively GMO potatoes and a level of tumour. And then, of course, it's the same problem of he falsified then some of his results, but he's still knocking around, and he's a bit like a flat earther, just won't go away.
Mm.
And he's still being quoted, even though the papers have been retracted and all the rest of it. I've forgotten what his name is now. Begins with W, I think, from memory. But he did the same with the MMR vaccine, seemingly to show that the MMR triple 3-in-1 had a higher incidence of autism than the 3 separate. And that just starts the ball rolling on, the vaccines are either trying to put a chip inside you so Bill Gates can follow you about. Please don't leave your phone behind. Or it's COVID's just here to try and knock off the population level so that they can survive the collapse. All in New Zealand. And there was there's a magazine called Quantum Magazine. That's a general science thing. And there's a geologist there who works for them repeatedly, a guy called Howard, and he's done like a 5-page potted history of climate science. This is all the big variables and why they are part of the immediate climate cycle or not. Yeah, that one. And so it's 2021. Howard Lee, from memory. I can't remember the title off the top of my head. But he starts off with things like, the solar variability, the wobble in the axis, the variability of the orbit, volcanoes. Then he also goes through elements of why they're not impacting the variability added by the anthropological greenhouse gases of, the biggest known ever single volcano in modern times, something on the order of 350 million tons of CO2, which is like less than 1,000 something, or 100 of the normal annual modern time human CO2. And then there was how much does meteors do? And of course, everybody then goes and says, well, it killed all the dinosaurs, except that was a freak, as most extinctions are, except this one now seems to be a bit more deliberate, as opposed to a complete freak. But he goes through a good set of 15 odd criteria. And it's actually quite a good little potted history. And that's worth being like possibly in the toolkit for being one of the first things you say, okay, have you actually read this? And do you agree with all of these points? Or are you agnostic or against the fact that whichever, pick one, and you can see it. The other one that I enjoy some of the history for is the flat earthers and the way how that has grown because of Google. You can use Google Analytics and search for the flat earthers. There's a trickle on and off all the way through the Enlightenment, Victorian, Edwardian times. A tiny trickle. And then there's a dozen or so odd bits and pieces that get leaked out onto the internet once that started. And then Google comes along and it explodes. And it's a guy called Ian McIntyre, done a book and a couple of YouTubers that goes through some of the math of the Google count, as well as he goes mufti to the flat earthers conferences and then confesses that he's a scientist on day 2, as it were, or halfway through, having already tried to understand why some of the flat earthers are flat earthers, including the fact that he's found a flight that goes from Auckland to Santiago in Chile that goes over Antarctica, such that if Antarctica is just this ice ridge round the edge of a disc,
You'd be flying off the world.
then you should see it out the window.
Nice.
And so there's a couple of the flat earthers take him up on this, and then as they go to bed and come back the following morning, they come back with some questions. And it's like, well, how do we know what fuel consumption is from a jet? They could all be lying and making the numbers up so that we get cheated. And it's this constant shifting of the goalposts, such that there's no true real understanding of conjecture, hypothesis, theory, nor
Did he actually come up with a reason that
I
went there looking for why they want to believe, you know?
There was one of the cases he spoke about was this woman who he sort of pigeonholed on at the end of the second day on one of these things. And she turned out to decide it was, oh, I had a vision. God sent me the vision. God told me. End of. That's it. Right? And it's
that accounts for one.
Yeah. But she's now quite a big, the equivalent of evangelist, I suppose, in this thing.
Oh, okay.
So
it's David Hume all over again. It's evidence of miracles, not actual miracles. It's testimony.
Yeah. So Ian McIntyre, I'll dig out a reference if I get a chance. But he's given the way he engages, it's actually quite entertaining, the hurdles he can get them to jump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to watch people. I mean, and it does. I guess it sort of feeds the whole let's argue and hate on each other and call names and stuff. But I ran across this young guy who's an archaeologist who did a whole series debunking Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse Netflix special. He calls himself Mini Minuteman, and he's like a 20-something guy who just graduated college with, I think, a bachelor's in archaeology, and decided to, I mean, he was already a kind of a TikTok star and stuff, and decided to become a YouTuber. Oh, Annie has decided that this is not relevant to any of her interests.
That's mean.
So
That's a terrible thing to say when there's 3 more minutes and then we're all gonna go.
yeah, no, yeah, that was a fair, but I did actually, it did just occur to me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pin it on her that we were far afield.
Well, you mentioned Graham, and obviously she knows he's a total quack. So off she runs. There were some good, there were some fairly good production values in that Netflix series he got made. Yeah, I actually sat and watched all the way through it.
I did
because
too.
I know a handful of anthropologists and archaeologists who are like, this guy is just totally quackers.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is and some of his overall thesis is just total wackadoo and doesn't fit either within a system or without a system. It's just his own system. Mm-hmm. And oddly, I ran across a couple of his books in a used bookstore this week, which I was like, oh, wow, that's like, okay. So he's making money doing this stuff.
Jason to Eric von Daniken.
But in watching it, I did take a couple of pages of notes on things that are interesting and useful as ideas in and of themselves that I now then have to double check his sources to see if they fit into a broader thesis that I've been working on.
Yeah.
So it was interesting for the creativity of it, but
some of the things that he talked about, some of the places he went were places I didn't know about, so it was valuable. So I mean, the underground there's my thumbs up. Yeah, that underground area in the soft, the chalky ground in Turkey, where all these people were sort of living underground and in these elaborate cave systems. Never heard of that. That was really interesting.
Yeah.
One thing that I will say is that that this guy, this mini Minuteman guy, his first name is Milo. I don't remember his last name. Actually goes to he's made enough money on YouTube that he has gone to and he led a tour to Göbekli Tepe and then to the other one nearby that Hancock didn't get to go to, and so he went to that one as well. And he was like the first person with a film crew to be able to go in there. So some of his stuff is actually fairly interesting because he does it from a kind of a more responsible perspective. And he talks about some of the realities behind some of the things that
What was his name, the YouTuber?
he goes by Mini Minuteman,
Okay.
and his name is Milo. I can't remember his last name. Yeah, so the reading for next week. Shall we read the last two chapters because they're a little bit smaller? Let me just look
Yeah,
at the,
we can do
quickly
that.
look at the page count in the thing. So 11, begins at 4:19 and 12 ends at 5:38. So we just finish it.
Yeah.
Read the after, kind of read the afterward too.
And then after that, we can reread it again and actually really like analytically pull it all out.
Yeah, I'm a little bit behind in transferring my notes into my vault. So yeah. Yep. And we also have to talk about what we're going to do next. But yeah, we can be thinking about that and putting stuff in the vault this week. All right. Cool. Thanks. See you soon.
Thanks, Dan.
You know,